Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Sam Peterson, Associate Director with the Pacific Council, and welcome to our webinar examining the impact of the United Kingdom's recent national election. Our two speakers will discuss for about 40 minutes today before we turn it over to Q&A, so please submit any questions you have via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. I'm so pleased to be joined by two exceptional experts today. Ambassador Philip Rieker has a distinguished career and is currently chair of the Wilson Center's Global Europe Program and partner and lead of the Europe and Eurasia practice at Albright Stonebridge Group. Before joining the Wilson Center, the ambassador served as at the U.S. Embassy in the United Kingdom and was also acting Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. Also joining us is Dr. Garrett Martin. Dr. Martin is the Senior Professional Lecturer and the Co-Director of the Transatlantic Policy Center at American University. He has written extensively on transatlantic relations in Europe and is a frequent media contributor, providing analysis and interviews to the NPR, the BBC, CNN, USA Today, and France 24. Please join me in welcoming both of our speakers. Thank you both for being here, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Martin for his opening remarks to begin the call.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you very much to the Pacific Council for hosting us today. And of course, very apropos, this has been dubbed the year of elections. There's been the ones we knew were about to happen or were going to happen, and then the surprise ones. We knew an election was likely to happen in the UK before January 2025. It was brought forward earlier in the summer, which hadn't been done in many decades. So obviously a lot to talk about, but maybe Ambassador Rieker, what's the big picture or the big takeaway from your perspective from this election?
Well, thanks. Thanks to the Pacific Council, and thanks, Dr. Martin. I'm delighted to join you and talk a little bit about these elections, which were held, of course, on July 4th. I suppose a little irony that the day that the United States was celebrating, declaring independence from England and from the crown of George III, the UK was voting on a new parliament, and of course, Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, went to see King Charles III and is now the Prime Minister. I spent, as you noted, a year as the interim ambassador in London from 2021 to 22 during what was already a tumultuous period, and I think what we've seen with these elections really was two contrasting records that came together, broken by the general election. First, there was a culmination, really, of an exceptionally dramatic 5 years in UK politics. And the record, of course, is that more people voted to remove the government, that is, the Conservative government, at that point, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, than ever before. Only 24% of the electorate of those voting backed the Conservatives, the Tory. 76% voted for another party. But the second record, and I think the other big takeaway from this, is that only 34% actually backed the Labour Party. So while they had a landslide win in terms of the number of seats in Parliament, a majority of 174 seats, 412 members in Parliament, only 238 members of Parliament, won by all the other parties combined. This is actually the lowest share won by a party securing an overall majority in the Parliament. So some of this, worth noting for American audiences in particular, those who study democratic systems, study UK politics, this is because of the sort of first past the post system for voting in the UK. So what we have is an emphatic rejection of the Conservative rule after 14 years in power. That started, of course, with David Cameron coming in, went through the tumultuous and in many views disastrous Brexit decision, and then the years of, some would say, circus under Boris Johnson. Of course, Theresa May had come in for a period, been ousted. Boris Johnson came in, and then the short 49-day government of Liz Truss until Rishi Sunak took the reins and tried to pull together some semblance of a campaign before this election. At the same time, while the Conservatives were resoundingly rejected, it's far from an enthusiastic endorsement of the Labour Party. I think the mood, if you were trying to sum it up in the UK, and I saw this while I was living and overseeing our mission there, was one of relief. If you go back to 1997, when Tony Blair came in, the last time there was a big Labour victory, it was one of optimism, jubilation in many feelings. Of course, Tony Blair came in with a strong economy to back him and pursue these years of cool Britannia. Now the economy is very precarious. Growth has stagnated in the United Kingdom. There is a feeling throughout the country that things are just broken, from the National Health Service to politics itself. And so, while everything that could go wrong for the Conservatives, I think, did go wrong, it is a challenge for Labour to see if they can make enough change, and change is the key operative word, in these next years, that by the time the next election comes round, it'll be required no later than 5 years from now, at 2029, if they can gain re-election. Because as I said, their landslide win in Parliament was actually based on just 34% of the voters choosing Labour.
I fully agree. I think it's a paradoxical landslide. I think that's the important element here, because if you just look at the sheer number of seats, you could be surprised, confused, or believe that this was a major endorsement by the British electorate for the Labour program. But again, if you look at the percentage of votes, it's actually a lot less even than 7 years ago, when they didn't gain a majority. So I think that's surprising. I think what that means also is, historically, this is one of the lowest combined percentage of votes for the two dominant parties of British politics. So I think it's also a story, in my view, of fragmentation. You also have a number of other actors that either come back up. You're thinking about the Liberal Democrats, the surprise player in Reform and in Nigel Farage. I mean, our American audience might be familiar with him, but that was a pretty historic performance to gain 14% of the votes, many of those taken away from the Conservative Party. It was an election also where Starmer is quite unpopular himself. He just happens to be far less unpopular than his other counterpart in Rishi Sunak. So that also, I think, is a major shift from what we saw last time Labour came back to power, as you mentioned, in 1997, where there was strong favorability towards Tony Blair. So even though he has Starmer a large majority, how much of a honeymoon, how patient is the British voter going to be with him, considering the significant depth of challenges that lie ahead? So maybe to follow up on some of the points you mentioned, Ambassador, I mean, yes, this was an election really which was about a referendum on the Conservatives and 14 years of Conservative government, and the British voters spoke clearly. But what do you think maybe Starmer and Labour did well, though? Is it only a story of voting against who you don't like, or are there ways in terms of campaign strategy or in terms of how he conducted himself in opposition that laid the ground for this large victory?
Well, Keir Starmer is not, by his own admission, a particularly charismatic leader. Boris Johnson, for all the controversy surrounding him, was always considered to be charismatic. He speaks dramatically. He is one for the moment and the show. With him, as many people said, it was a circus, let alone a series of scandals and gaffes throughout his Liz Truss's and even into the Sunak governments under the Conservatives. So Keir Starmer came in as the leader, having rejected Jeremy Corbyn, who was considered truly toxic, a radical socialist by just about any standards, who had seen Labour to a dismal defeat against Boris Johnson in the last election. Once Corbyn was out and Starmer came in, he focused a very disciplined approach to the shadow government, that is, being in opposition. And then once the elections were called, a very disciplined campaign. He was careful not to promise too much, things that he likely knows he won't be able to deliver. It is a party somewhat transformed, certainly from the period of Jeremy Corbyn. They've reinvented themselves under Keir Starmer and some very strong senior members of the cabinet. David Lammy is well experienced in foreign affairs, somebody that I obviously worked with in London and is well known here in Washington and in other capitals. John Healey, their Secretary for Defense, extremely capable and experienced, good connections and good continuity, which both the former government, the Conservatives, were promising us there would be continuity, particularly in terms of foreign policy, of security and defense. The focus now that Starmer has to take and has said he will take is on growth, on building more housing and infrastructure. The phrase that they're using with the new government is a new deal for working people, taking back control, which also means support for local governments and devolving of power, not the so-called leveling up that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives tried to sell to the people of the United Kingdom. I think you'll see careful steps laid out, and it's great that we're having this conversation today, because tomorrow, on July 17th, in the King's speech, you will see laid out very clearly the agenda that the new government of the Labour Party under Keir Starmer is laying out. They will talk about some 30 to 35 bills, pieces of legislation. I mean, some of this, like our State of the Union address, is more for show, but we'll get a good picture tomorrow of exactly where Labour is going to focus. And I think Starmer has a reputation of working relentlessly towards a goal. And so he will pursue a number of those things, particularly home building. On the security and foreign policy front, he's got to deal with the so-called small boats, the immigration question, people coming from the continent across the English Channel. The Conservatives, with all kinds of plans and approaches, were unable to stop that. It will be good that Starmer will pursue much better relations with Europe, a sort of rapprochement, if you will, with the continent, with the EU, with France, because as I often reminded people in the UK, Britain is still part of Europe, even if it's not in the European Union. So we'll see reviewing of policies. Remember, it's been 14 years since the Labour Party was in government and had the responsibilities of government. So they'll review things. They will create bodies to study problems. But I think we'll see hard work, and they do have to accomplish a lot in these first years to be able to hope to win back re-election within 5 years.
No, absolutely. I think I agree with you in the sense also that Starmer, I think, really did a masterful job of taking over a Labour Party that was in a poor shape after, and this is again another paradox, Labour had one of its worst performances in 2019, its worst performance since the 1930s, and then now this time around nearly had a record number of seats. So it speaks to great volatility, but I think he did a great job of campaigning to take over the Labour Party slightly more to the left, and once in office has pivoted more to the center, and also very much purge. I mean, I think the word is not too lenient, purge some of the Corbynites and some of the groups that had really caused harm. So I think he's certainly shown that he can be quite ruthless as well in terms of party management, which is important when you think about British politics, where you can easily be taken out by your own party, as we saw many times for the Conservatives. I think also an interesting parallel for the United States, which is in 2019, Labour lost a lot of its traditional support in the North, the so-called red wall, red for the color of the Labour Party. And those were the people who were traditional Labour voters but had voted to leave the EU, and were taken over, were cultivated by Boris Johnson in 2019. And a lot of what Starmer did, I think, was really try to win those voters back with really bread and butter economic issues, as you mentioned. So I think that's also an interesting parallel with what we see in terms of American politics in the Midwest, when those kind of key battleground states there, and what the Biden administration, I think, did in 2020. So obviously, we've spoken a little bit about Labor. I think for the Conservatives, their worst performance in terms of number of seats in over 100 years. So again, that speaks to, I think, the scale. They lost 250 seats, which is sort of an astounding number.
I think it's the most in history since the founding of the Conservative Party in 1832.
Right. So, an epic defeat, I think, might be, a fair term here, and without hyperbole. But and they lost a number of voters to a lot of different areas. Obviously, significant number of voters who had voted Conservative went to Reform, so basically being outflanked on the right. But they also lost voters to the Liberal Democrats, and even a few to the Greens. So, what does it mean for the future of the Conservative Party in your view? Like, how do they rebuild from this? Because they're kind of torn, or they were undermined by multiple and contradictory directions. How do you see the party? Do you see it moving further to the right and trying to swallow back up those Reform voters and basically making a sharp turn? Or do you see them doing a kind of a bit of a similar purge that we saw, and maybe trying to go back to the center because that's where you can win the election?
It is an important question, and historically, as I looked back and spoke to political analysts and experts on UK politics, going back 2 centuries, with a defeat like this, it has taken the defeated party nearly a decade to sort of regroup and find themselves a footing in order to win an election again. The challenge, I think, facing the Conservatives, the Tories as they're known, if anything, is tougher than the one facing Starmer. Starmer comes in with this large majority in Parliament, in a sense, virtually untrammeled power, the kinds of power that an American president would really love to have. He has a freedom to do things with this parliamentary majority and get things done. And the Labour Party seems united at this point. One reason that the Conservatives, I think, have dominated the past century is that the center left was divided between Labour and other liberal traditions. The Liberal Party, the Labour Party being on the left, but competing with various other traditions that we would consider liberal in terms of politics. Now, I think you see that the right is almost fatally divided. You have this emergence of Reform. They only got 5 seats, including Nigel Farage, a voice that if you haven't heard him already, Americans, you will hear him. He's been a frequent visitor to the United States and gotten involved in our politics. A strong supporter, obviously, of former President Trump, now candidate Trump as well. He won actually quite a lot of votes, but because of the first past the post rule, he just has 5 seats in the parliament. I don't believe that there is much appetite among the Conservatives, even in their defeat, to merge with Reform. I think they will instead seek to find a new center, some sort of return to the center. Whether that's what will happen remains to be seen. It's early days. There'll be a leadership battle and challenge. What's the future for Rishi Sunak, who admittedly, and I can speak from experience, I found him to be one of the more sort of sensible, practical actors of the inner core of the Conservative government, certainly under Prime Minister Johnson. And he made efforts, reach out to Europe to calm things. He was bedeviled by a series of and just a record of scandals that the population was tired of. Will he return as leader? It's uncertain yet. And if the Conservatives descend into infighting and recrimination and backbiting, that could mean a much longer period for them to reemerge. Some analysts I've talked to have suggested more of a two-stage process. A leader who is right-wing on issues like immigration, on Europe, very realistically, I think strategically, Keir Starmer did not bring the Brexit argument back into the discussion during this campaign because he knew he opened that. But the whole tax and spend idea will be front and foremost on conservative thinkers. And they will try to marginalize reform, seeing that as more extreme, and try to get back to the center. Even if they succeed, I think, though, in defeating reform, they could risk being seen as deserting the center ground. And that, of course, is where they have to find themselves. All of it will depend, of course, as always, in 4 years' time or up to 5 years' time, where do voters feel they've come? Has there been a change, particularly in the economic circumstances? Not just statistically, some good news coming out with growth slightly higher already in the UK. That greets this King's speech that we'll hear tomorrow and is a good start for this new Labour government. But it'll be less about ideology, even in 4 years' time, than whether people feel that progress has been made, that change was implemented, and they can get back to a country where they feel proud of, where there is actually growth, where infrastructure is being repaired, where jobs are created, where inflation is in check. The issues they're facing, very much same issues that we hear about here: concerns about migration, concerns about crime, concerns about the economy and inflation.
Starmer, I think, nearly had the dream start had England prevailed in the final of the European Soccer Championship. Considering, obviously, I've also lived in London for 10 years. You can know how soccer crazy the English are. So that would have been even a perfect start, but not to be for England. I think a couple of of significant points here. I think is one, to keep in mind that the fear about being outflanked on the right has been, I think, a long-standing problem for the Conservatives, really dating back to really most of the 21st century. Even in opposition, they were worried about, at the time, the UK Independence Party that was pushing and pushing for a referendum on the UK staying in the EU. That really played a big part in David Cameron's, in my view, disastrous decision to call the referendum, or at least not well thought through. So I think it's been a problem, and it's pushed the Conservatives sometimes more to the right than they wanted, but they've been really concerned about having votes siphoned off. And so I think that risks being, a further concern. We've seen, if you look also in other European countries where sort of center-right governments have tried to sometimes copy, emulate the language of the far right to try and undercut. But that has not necessarily worked very well. So I think that is a concern, that some of the voices in the Conservative Party might push the party further to the right. And I agree, I think that will make the quest to come back to power that much more significant. I think also the scale of economic challenges for Starmer and Labour, I think it is significant, really steep. The UK has underperformed economically compared to all the other G7 countries, and quite clearly. Wages have been stagnant for a long time. I mean, the after effect of the policy of austerity that was launched back in the early 2010s by the Cameron government, dealing with the effects of the financial crisis, have really starved public services and have had real consequences on ordinary citizens of the UK. So, the margin of maneuver for Keir Starmer, I think, is limited. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. And of course, I think that's a good way to pivot, maybe to look at foreign policy. It's also, to put it mildly, quite a challenging time on the international stage, with multiple wars, great uncertainty, the rise of China, to name just a few. So on the foreign policy front, to what degree do you think we will see a distinct shift under a Starmer government, or to a large degree, do you see some consensus between Conservatives and Labour, and maybe there'll be change in style, but the goals and the focus will not be dramatically different?
I think really, Garrett, it'll be the latter. I don't expect major changes. In fact, as I mentioned, both the outgoing government officials and the Labour Party, as they visited the US, as they touched base, if you will, underscored an expectation of continuity of leadership, of portfolios, of policies. Strong support for Ukraine. The UK, even under Boris Johnson, was extremely forward-leaning on support for Ukraine against Vladimir Putin's unprovoked, illegal war, the brutal reality of which we continue to see every day, 2.5 years after the full-scale invasion in February of 22, when I was in London, in fact, and terrific coordination among the US, of course, and the UK as the closest of allies. That will continue. And I think the special relationship, as some call it, the essential relationship, as others see it, certainly the historic cooperation between the United Kingdom and the United States will remain vital to both of our countries, vital to the NATO alliance. Of course, Keir Starmer arrived to a very warm welcome in Washington, not only because it's 100 degrees last week and this week, but welcomed by President Biden and by all of the NATO allies for his first big international outing as we marked the 75th anniversary of NATO, reinforced the solidarity, cohesion, and purpose of the alliance. That is a defensive alliance that is focused on deterrence. And of course, what's happened in Ukraine has made us all realize the importance of that, the historic role that the alliance played, not only for the UK as a founding member along with us, but for other European countries that gave us in Europe and in the North Atlantic space a period of unprecedented stability, peace, and then prosperity since the end of World War II, since 1949 and the establishment of NATO. Without security, you cannot have the kind of prosperity we had. And it guided us through the Cold War when there was a real threat of Stalinist Soviet expansion. We saw what happened in Europe further east and Central Europe. Of course, through 1989 and the fall of the wall, great expectations of new opportunities, saw these new democracies that were formerly under the Soviet yoke seeking themselves to join NATO and the alliance. UK, crucial to that and very much a part of it. I think you'll see a reach to Europe, to Brussels, to the EU, that is, to increasingly improve relations. When I left London after a year in June of 22, even then Foreign Secretary Liz Truss was concerned privately with me about the state of relations with France, for instance. Boris Johnson and President Macron in France had a really difficult personal relationship. There was a lot of bitterness over Brexit. I said at the time, I often felt like a divorce counselor trying to remind our friends that we really were all part of a big family, even though this separation, that is Brexit, had taken place. As you pointed out, I think Brexit a terrible mistake. I think many in the UK are realizing that, giving up their largest market and all of the advantages that the EU provides, along with certain challenges. That is still a touchy topic. I don't see revisiting EU membership, certainly not in this first Labour government, while they need to focus instead on renewal, growth, fixing what's broken in the United Kingdom. And they will look for better relations with the EU to do that. On China, I think it'll be very interesting to watch, of course, David Cameron and the Conservatives having really embraced China in the early years of their government, having gone to Beijing, having promoted major investment by Chinese, then realizing, of course, as we did in the United States, that all was not particularly rosy in some of the Chinese ambitions, and whether it was human rights or their military growth, the threats that they pose, the challenges that even NATO recognized in its new security concept promulgated in 2022, that China poses a challenge, a security challenge. And indeed, in the communique from last week's NATO summit, it was underscored that China's raw support of Russia in this war of Putin's against Ukraine is something that is a threat to the stability of Europe and to the alliance. So questions about China will remain, concerns about China, about investment and influence. UK also focused with us on the Indo-Pacific and Asia. We've learned that we've got to be able to deal with all of these challenges to our security, to our economic well-being, to our supply chains. If you look at, say, the Red Sea and what's been going on there, Houthis in Yemen threatening shipping, they're supported and aided by Iran. That has an impact on our economies, on our supply chains, on the Suez Canal. So all over the planet, there are these challenges and threats. The UK, of course, a solid ally, part of the Five Eyes arrangement with Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And that, I think, will continue to be the backbone. We also have something that was established under the Boris Johnson government, known as AUKUS, agreed to by Australia, the UK, and the United States to work together, building on that trusted ally, friend, and technology transfer to help the Australians acquire the necessary next generation of submarines, but in the second pillar of AUKUS to expand that to other areas, because defense, as well as economy, is now such a hybrid concept. Technology is so critical. Cyber, space, these domains undersea are really what's crucial now. AI, a big role both in defense and civilian applications. These are all areas where we will work together. The G7 is a very good format and platform for coordinating that, along with the other major democratic economies. So I think we'll see some continuity, a reversal on some of the immigration plans. The conservative government had established a program to send would-be migrants to Rwanda. I think that will be out now under Labour, and they will have to deal with the challenge from the so-called small boats. And to do that, I think better cooperation with Brussels, where they can work together, as they have, of course, so successfully in the past, is what will be seen.
No, I was struck when writing recently about the elections by the fact that there is a real window of opportunity for Keir Starmer, in the sense that who is the best placed interlocutor for an American government in Europe at present? I mean, France is obviously dealing with significant internal challenges. The very same can be said about Germany and Olaf Scholz. His coalition is dealing with great unfavorability as well. So on paper, I think there is an opportunity here for Keir Starmer. But I think some of the big ticket items that you've already covered and alluded to, Ambassador, there are some warning signs. I mean, I think on Ukraine, yes, the UK has been a steadfast supporter, but they are a partisan of having an immediate invitation to Ukraine to join, whereas the Biden administration is not. There's pressure to increase defense spending to 2.5% of GDP. Starmer has been somewhat vague about the deadline. We know how much defense spending under former President Trump was a big point of collision. Unsurprisingly, the Middle East, Gaza, is also very much a domestic issue for Labour, for the reasons dealing in the past with accusations of anti-Semitism against his predecessor, but also because there's a strong Muslim support for Labour, and many of them voted against Labour because of Starmer's stance towards Israel. Even on China, I think there are potentials of differences, and of course, I think the elephant in the room is the question of personality. So we know that I think Starmer has admired Biden's approach philosophically, probably more alignment on paper. But do you see, if the outcome of the election goes to Trump, do you see more difficulties for the special relationship? Do you think that fundamentally they'll be able to work it through regardless, or do you see that there could be a significant difference depending on how the American vote goes in November?
Well, I think that the basic answer, and something that I've thought about a lot, is that the U.S.-UK relationship is so durable, is so fundamental at every level, from defense to economics, investment, and trade, to our shared history, to our cultural and social exchanges, that it will endure and endure far beyond any single American administration or UK government. And I think we'll see that again. I was Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia during the last 2 years of the Trump administration. I'm a career diplomat at the State Department, and have worked for administrations, Republican, Democrat. I worked for Madeleine Albright one day, Colin Powell the next. And the important thing, particularly with our European allies, is the endurance of the institutions, but the relationships. There was concern, certainly in London, that when the Biden administration came in January of 2021, that there would be a negative reaction against Boris Johnson and the Conservatives. Indeed, of course, there was great disappointment at the time of Brexit, the vote in 2016. But I saw up close and personal Boris Johnson and President Biden forge a perfectly good working relationship. They understood what transcended, again, the political leanings on either side. And while we'll hear ideas, accusations were flying in London that President Biden was anti-English because of his Irish background. In fact, the Bidens came from Essex, I believe. And while he's proud of his Irish roots, these things are more than superficial, and our relationship is strong. So there may be disagreements. There's room for that in any family, in any alliance, in any diplomatic relationship. But fundamentally, our values are still shared, and that's the basis of foreign policy in many respects. Our futures are ones that we need to share together. And so I think while you may see ups and downs, the UK is a strong ally. They do meet the targeted 2%. In fact, now the alliance as a whole is meeting more than 2% of overall GDP of all of the NATO allies. More than 2% is being spent on defense now. That's crucial. Individually, 23 out of the 32 allies are meeting that standard, and more to come. Even the Canadians, who have been perhaps the laggards on this, mostly have now a plan to try to meet that need. I think Putin's threats and what we see from China and other challenges around the world, as I said, hybrid challenges, multi-domain challenges, have made governments in Europe understand. Even the Germans have said, we've got to spend more on our defense because these threats are real and they're out there. You saw Sweden and Finland having been good partners of NATO. As soon as Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, they realized that their place needed to be as firm allies within NATO. So despite Putin's stated opposition to NATO enlargement, even though it's a defensive alliance, he pushed these two countries to want to join the alliance because of the threat he poses. So we share those, and certainly Washington and London, Whitehall and the White House are really knitted up together. Our militaries, of course, working extremely closely together.
No, I fully agree. And I think on the issue of again, as an Irishman, to full disclosure, I certainly think the Irish question in Northern Ireland was an impediment to good relations between the UK and the US for a while, because of the after effects of Brexit. I think the Windsor framework has calmed down the situation somewhat, but it's true. I think the UK did hurt itself in Washington because you have some vigorous defenders of the Good Friday Agreement. So I think that's something for Starmer that he does need to be mindful of, because you have strong sentiments and obviously strong pride on the part, considering the important American role over the years in bringing stability to the conflict in Northern Ireland. So I think that's something that is important in moving forward.
And of course, just to highlight that, that was a challenge that was brought on because of Brexit.
Right.
The Good Friday Accord, the Belfast Agreement had very much been able to take place because both the UK and the Republic of Ireland were in the European Union, and so the freedom of movement, trade, was critical to that. The borderless nature of Ireland, this so-called solution that Boris Johnson was trying to come up with, the Northern Ireland Protocol, just caused all kinds of trouble. And indeed, the US, and I was often the person to deliver those messages, was saying, don't mess up the gains of the Good Friday Accords. The Belfast Agreement is crucial to peace there. It's one of the great examples of negotiated settlement, and nobody wanted to see a return to that. So I suspect Starmer will be very mindful of that, and the better relations that he pursues with the EU will help to find solutions and ways around that, even with Brexit.
So I'm going to mention to our listeners that we will very soon pivot to your questions. So a reminder, there are already a few questions lined up, but don't be shy. We welcome your questions as well. But just before we do that, I'm maybe very quickly, Ambassador, because I'm sort of thinking about in terms of as a planetary metaphor, where I feel the UK now outside of the EU is facing a lot of different sort of gravitational pulls from big blocs. Yes, they're talking about improving relations with the EU, but my concern is there really on the other side great appetite to deal with the UK again, considering the scars of Brexit and the fact that the EU itself has significant other challenges to deal with. So, I welcome the rhetoric, I welcome the new messaging that we're getting from London, but is that going to be enough? On China, I feel the UK is torn between its own economic interests with China and trying to find the balance, and of course, understanding that in the United States, clearly the needle has moved. Great power competition is accepted on a bipartisan basis. So, how do you feel, in your view, the difficulties for Starmer to deal with those different sort of trade-offs?
Was clear in the campaign itself. Starmer, as I said, did not return to refight the Brexit battle. I think quite wisely, he understood that was not a winner for him. While there is, I think, perhaps now a regret among many, because they've seen the impact of Brexit, what it took away, the damage it's done to the UK economy, to the convenience of borderless travel with the rest of Europe. He knew that not only was that not going to be a winner because of ongoing concerns about migration and other issues that led to the whole Brexit process. And of course, we can have a whole other webinar on the role of Russian disinformation and manipulation on that. At the same time, he also knew that the EU in Brussels, while welcoming better relations with the UK and remembering those, as I call them, family ties that they have, the EU is not about to offer membership again to the United Kingdom, and they're going to wait and see how this goes. I think eventually down the road there could be renewed formats for engaging some type of membership that may be in the future, but that's not going to happen right away. You can't be going in and out of the European Union. The disruption of leaving, what it takes to join and merge laws to be in compliance with EU regulations as well. It's just too complex. So I think the Europeans will welcome this better relationship. In fact, it was Macron who sort of pushed the idea of this European political community, which is a gathering, a more informal structure, but a gathering of all the countries of Europe, members of the EU, the 27, but those that are not, including the United Kingdom. And in fact, the meeting of the European political community will take place coming up, I think, next week in the UK. So Labour will have been represented Keir Starmer at NATO. You'll have the King's speech tomorrow, where their platform will be laid out with the pageantry that goes along with the King opening Parliament, making this speech. And then you'll have all of the leaders of all of the European countries coming to London, to the UK, to have this European political community thing. That'll be a longer term process ongoing there. China, I do think they understand, as we do, the concerns and the threats. I think others, including here, despite the bipartisan nature of concern about China, have understood that the idea of decoupling economies is pretty radical. And so we came up with this de-risking idea, or friendshoring, or how can we work with China? I think the Biden administration has taken efforts to restart better communication. Some of that was the Chinese who had really cut off communication, and that, as a diplomat, I think is dangerous. So better communication, President Biden speaking with President Xi, being clear and candid about the concerns, the disagreements, but having channels to communicate, to de-escalate in some cases. But yet we still see what's happening with military buildup, the challenges in the South China Sea, the potential threats against Taiwan. These are all of great concern, and the UK is right with us on those issues, along with other allies. You will have seen, of course, at the NATO summit, again, just to come back to that and why it's applicable, besides focusing on deterrence and defense and support for Ukraine, the third major piece was underscoring partnerships. NATO, its 32 North Atlantic allies, relies on partnerships, and the so-called Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific partners, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, were represented at the highest levels again at this, because we have to have these partnerships. We cannot deal with the security challenges, let alone the economic challenges in the complex world we have alone. We've got to rely on allies and partners.
So I'm looking at the questions. I think some of them we've already maybe answered to a certain degree. I may at least add maybe a quick point for Dr. Duncan Wood's question about the opening for more positive relationship with the EU, even on a much more limited basis. I think, yes, there is an opening. There is potential here, because I think there is a welcome new tone. I think you have this very symbolic meeting of the European political community in the birthplace of Winston Churchill, no less.
Yes.
So I think that's important. Yeah. So I think that's certainly grandiose location, but I think it's also I think the Starmer administration, I think they are also understanding that they need to hedge their bets. I think, of course, a special relationship is vitally important, but there is a possibility, depending on how the election goes in the US, that you may have some retrenchment from Europe, from a future American administration. So I think there's an understanding from the Starmer administration that you cannot have relations that are so bad with the continent as sometimes happened in the previous years. I think there's some low-hanging fruit issues that are ripe for cooperation. I think one of them that wouldn't be difficult would be over youth mobility. There are a lot of great programs to encourage students from across Europe to go and study abroad. The UK left the so-called Erasmus program. I think that was, again, that's something that's not hard to do. It would be certainly popular, and I think it's an important step. But on the bigger issues, I think the fundamental challenge that the EU had with Brexit or during the negotiations is they were worried about an a la carte approach, that the UK would try to get all of the benefits without the responsibilities of being a member of the club. and so if there is a rapprochement, this will be done and negotiated very, seriously by both sides. And I wouldn't expect any gifts for the UK just because they're led by a different party. So that will still happen. There is sort of hard-nosed realism on the part of the EU as well. And I think for Starmer, there's also the challenge that you don't want to be seen as trying to undermine Brexit by, death by a thousand cuts. Like if you're trying to inane be a member again, or even give that impression to your political opponents, that's a tricky balance. I mean, whether we agree with Brexit or not, it was about taking back control and sovereignty. So any impression that you are undermining that could be politically difficult. So we have a very good question from an anonymous question from one of our attendees, and maybe I'll hand it to you, Ambassador, first, which is really to work on what we were saying earlier. Given those large fiscal difficulties that the UK is dealing with now, how realistic, how difficult will it be for Labour to really enact their campaign promises and commitments?
No, I think that cuts right to the point. And as I mentioned, Keir Starmer was strategically very careful not to overpromise in this campaign. That may be partially why, while they won this large majority, they only had 34% of the overall vote. There wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for this, and he wasn't promising the sky. He knows that he is going to face real economic challenges, stagnation, weak public finances, high borrowing that has gone on. And so they do have a strong reform agenda coming back into government. Remember, after 14 years, so fairly inexperienced new government and cabinet. So they're going to have to navigate those realities, those fiscal realities. He's trying to have a more streamlined government, looking to more efficiencies. You'll hear a lot of that in tomorrow's King's speech. Trying to promise stability. I think there was a feeling in the UK that there was so much chaos particularly under Boris Johnson, and in recent years, 5 different prime ministers, constant gaffes, many scandals, that a level of stability and consistency is what Keir Starmer was doing, and that in itself doesn't cost. And Labour's plans, I think, for workers' rights reforms will be part of the first 100 days. That'll be a major test of its relationship with business. Some suspicion, of course, on business about Labour's traditional views and the social implications. I think it's crucial, and many have given the advice to Keir Starmer, don't get preoccupied with stamping out inequality or adding new subsidies. And he seems to have internalized that. He will run, I think, a pretty strict and tight government, as he did a campaign, and a opposition, shadow government in opposition. As I mentioned before, I think he will work relentlessly towards his goals, and that includes things like home building, getting the economy started. But he'll have to face that constant reality of the fiscal constraints, the real economic challenges that they have. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is, as I mentioned, I think, greeted by some positive news on the economic growth front as they start out. If they can continue that, leverage that, the markets are fairly optimistic. But again, lots of things will play into this, and the Labour government has its work cut out for it if they want to get re-elected in 4 or 5 years' time.
No, I could not agree more, and I would also suggest that the economic problems that the UK are facing are long in the making, and therefore you would have to think that they would be long in the solving as well. I mean, issues around wage stagnation, lack of innovation, productivity not really having gone up significantly, cannot be changed with a flip of a switch. So I think that will be difficult. Also, let's not lose track of politics. Having a large majority is obviously wonderful, but it's also a challenge because the risks of dissenting, the risks of backbencher rebellions do go up because you feel that you're not endangering your government if it has such a large majority. So how disciplined will the Labour Party be also in office? How easily or not will it sort of divide over a variety of foreseen and unforeseen challenges is also something important. I mean, the Conservatives were really a spectacle of division in the last few years, which didn't help their cause. We only have a few more minutes, Ambassador, so maybe to kind of wrap this around, and because we talked about, to go back to this being the year of elections, we had over a period of about 4 weeks, three major elections in Europe. The European Parliament doesn't necessarily get the same attention, but important nonetheless. Obviously, the election in the UK we're talking about, the election in France. And so is there a common narrative about those elections? But if so, is it that the center has held, even if it hasn't held always well? Is the narrative different than maybe it's really all about anti-incumbents, that people are fed up with whoever's in power and they're just taking on them? Is the story of volatility and fragmentation, that's become very hard to govern because you don't have clear dominant parties anymore? Is that a helpful way to think about it, or do we really need to treat all of those?
Well, it is interesting to look at these things globally, and I think more and more we have to, even as the burgeoning world population kind of responds somewhat reflexively, I think, to globalization and technology and the change that has taken place, not just in my generation's lifetimes, but really just in the past decade or two. It is a readjustment, and you see a lot of dissatisfaction around the world, but yet you see a lot of democracy, and that's reflected in these elections, this year of elections, more people going to polls than any time else in history. The expectation of the European parliamentary elections, it would show a strong swing to the right, and in some cases extreme right, did not play out. There was an increase, and it's something that has to be noted. It reflects a frustration with status quo and perhaps traditional parties or traditional policies. But the center largely held, and we'll see a return with the new European Commission, the European Commission, which of course is what enacts the rules and regulations, governs generally day to day for the European Union. We'll find that out soon, whether Ursula von der Leyen will return as the president of the European Commission. That is expected. Of course, one of the big surprises was Macron, where in France, there was this strong showing in the first round of elections, which he called after the European parliamentary elections. He called these snap elections. It was considered, a complete surprise to many. I had French colleagues just lamenting this move by Macron, who, to be fair, has done a lot to boost the French economy in recent years, and he's been hobbled by both the left and the right, and his own, I would say, perhaps self-confidence, or some would say hubris. That, of course, in the second round of those elections, proved to be not the case. The right was defeated. The left and even Macron's more centrist group out ahead. So it's a time of disruption. People want to see change. They want their voices heard. We're seeing that here in the United States as well. This is now the election in these next months that everyone will be watching. November 5th, the outcome, which will have an enormous impact on every corner of the globe, frankly, what happens in the United States. And it is something that I can tell you our European allies, colleagues, observers are watching very, very closely what kind of impact that will have for them, for the alliance, for security, for the war in Ukraine, for how we deal with China, for the Middle East. These are all things that are a real challenge. I'd end by just saying, throughout all of that, despite areas where we will perhaps have differences or we'll talk things through, with the United Kingdom, we do that. The UK has gone through a lot of change, really generational change, symbolic, of course, but the passing of the late Queen after 70 years on the throne I think had a significant impact and made people realize that they'd gotten used to a certain structure and stability. The monarchy, of course, plays a certain symbolic role in the United Kingdom, but it's had its challenges even this year with the health of the king and other questions. All of these things go into play together. It's just a reminder, once again, that you need friends and allies, and there are no better partners than the United States and the United Kingdom.
Well, I will, end on a couple of very quick points. One is, I think it's certainly clear to me that I think voters are not shy in expressing their opinions. They know what they're against, but they also sometimes struggle to really articulate what they're for. I think we've seen that in France. They're against the far right, but what exactly they want instead, that's clear. As to the importance of the American elections abroad, in Europe and elsewhere, an American friend a few years ago was in a remote village of the west of Ireland around the election and was shocked to hear that they were talking about returns in Maricopa County. So this is really elections that are followed closely in other parts of the world for understandable reasons. So I really want to warmly thank all of the listeners, and we're a little bit over time. I apologize. Ambassador Rika, pleasure exchanging with you, and to Sam and the whole Pacific Council team. It was a real pleasure and honor to being here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.